people would say, why don't you do some remote sensing? Well, it just didn't work, so the soils aren't proper out there for that sort of thing. In 2014 or 2015, my colleague John Leader, the state archaeologist, got himself a new piece of equipment. This was a gradiometer, which is a magnetometer 3 times. 3 magnetometers working together to investigate the soils. And what we're looking at is the magnetics in the ground. Over millions and thousands of years, every piece of metal and kind of metallic thing in the ground is going to align with the North and South poles. Anything that disturbs the ground churns all that stuff up. So there's going to be a difference between the things that have been churned up and the things that are in the ground and never been disturbed. So you get a nice picture. You can get a nice picture from a magnetometer if you've got the right kinds of soils. But in this case, a radiometer gives us a 3D kind of image. They all work together to give us something that pops out. And next slide. This is what popped out. Now that's cool to me. Okay, so there you see the sap and you see the fort, or the ditch of the fort. And that tells us more than 10 years worth of digging could tell us very quickly. And when I mean 10 years, I don't mean 10 full years, I mean 10 seasons of 2 weeks at a time going out digging a few holes. Okay, so what do you got? You've got a straight line heading right to the fort until it gets to it, and it's hard to see, we need to combine this with a LiDAR image. But right there, where it makes the first turn, is where the crest of the hill is. So as long as they were below the crest, the Americans could dig straight and fast without having the British worry too much about the British. When they got to the crest, they went into their zigzag mode. And they even put a parallel out right there, and then they moved on down, and they branched out. They were sending one parallel towards the fort and one at an angle. And the area that you saw where we excavated is not there. You can add that on to the top wing coming out, which I thought you had. Hold on. So there's a good extra 12 feet of sap going this way, which now indicates plan was the plan. They were planning on putting Continental soldiers right up there, right along here, so that they'd be close to the fort. And if you look at the fort and you think about that's the ditch, and you got to go out another couple, say 10 to 20 feet for the abatis. So they were right up next to the abatis and getting ready before for the main charge before they went in.
What's the size of that rectangle?
Well, it's about. The first thing is that it's a rectangle. It's not a square.
Yeah.
That's the first thing it is. So the house sits right here. There actually was a little plaza for those men. They weren't all crowded into the house. Makes a lot more sense. The size, I think, is probably, this is probably about 40 to 50, more like 30 to 40 yards, and this is about 50 to 60 yards. Okay, is that a better one? Goes on and on. Now, the next thing is, look at this. That's the gate. By the way, this is the well that we talked about that we found, or the big rain event of October 2015 found for us. This is the gate. Now, what's cool about the gate? Anybody tell me about the gate? And why that would be cool if you're an archaeologist and get real excited?
You're looking for some bodies?
Yeah, who said looking for the bodies? Yay! Good job, Karen. Remember the story. The story is that they hung 3 of them on Mrs. Motte's gate post. Well, if that's the gate post, then those guys got to be probably right around here. They're probably not here because this is where Jim Lake put our cross ditch intersect the first year we were there. So wouldn't that be fun? To go after those guys, to recover them, rebury them properly. So that's kind of what we're thinking about doing maybe in the future, is working on that. And also going back through here, we found absolutely in this area where we dug nothing, except a couple of little tiny nails. And I think the reason that's because that was the very last thing that was done before the siege ended, was to dig that last little trench out before the fight. Next slide. So there's a sort of a drawing picture of what we're looking at with the various balls also imposed on it. Next. Okay, artillery. That 6-pounder, says Larry Babbitt's cannon, was put up on a mound of earth in order to be able to fire high enough to reach the roof dot. That existed all the way up, unfortunately, to the 80s. The landowner was not as cognizant of the history at the time, and unfortunately had pushed it away one evening with a bulldozer. But when we started doing work there, we decided to go ahead and try to find that, and we found a picture of that, of an aerial photograph of that area from 1939. And we put that into a GIS system, got ourselves a GPS point, went out into the deep woods and looked around, and wow, couldn't find a thing. Didn't find a thing. So that kind of was on the back shelf for several years because it was just too thick to work in there. Next. And there's a picture of it where it's going to be found shortly. Go ahead. So 2013. We are starting our new season. We're coming up, and my colleague and I, Jim Lake, are in the truck. We come up the hill, we look over to the left, the road, and go, wow, Luther's cleared all this out. Maybe we can find something of that artillery mount. We drove back in there, and before we got out of the truck, we could see it. It's going to be kind of hard for you to see in this. No photograph does a good justice, but there it is. Remnant of the mound, right there. And there's me standing behind it, calling Luther and saying, hey, Luther, we found it. And you may be able to see a little bit of orange tape right there. That's our tape from 2004. We were right on top of it. We just couldn't see it because it was too thick. Next slide. And everybody knows, and we do know from the 2004 excavations, that the Americans were using canister against the British. They were going to fire a 6-pound ball against that house because it was Mrs. Mott's house. And you don't want to destroy the most wealthy person in South Carolina's house who's a strong supporter of the American Revolution. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, so we're going to fire canister, which are iron balls, fired out of that cannon to hit the British when they go up on the roof. Next slide. Except about 15 minutes into looking around that site, we found the 6-pound cannonball. Perfect size for the cannon that was supposed to be there. Next slide. There it is, cleaned up with some of the other artifacts we found. We found British shot firing. The British were shooting at that artillery position, trying to disrupt the Americans as they were getting ready to fire it. Next. We put a profile through it, trench through it. Next. And there's our proof that we have something human and disturbed. You're looking at the 1781 forest floor. You're looking at dirt that was piled up by probably by slaves. And these are the subsoils below it. So there's no doubt that's what it is. Next. Overseer's house. As I mentioned, Dick Watkins had figured out that this thing was probably the Lloyd house. the famous house where the devil went and met Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd and jumped off into the devil's footprint and across the way. Next slide. We've got excavations there. Next. They were doing some digging, and the artifacts, next, date to that period of time. They're mid-colonial period, 1750s, 1760s, 1740s range. So they fit right in with an early colonial structure being there about that time. Next. Camps. We've spent a lot of time finding things that we can't identify for sure. We have at least 2 camps, and they are mixed, Charlottesville, ostensibly American and provincial, and Brown Bess Balls. So we can't say for sure. We have no buttons, so we can't really say for sure who they belong to. Green camped at Fort Motte several times. We don't know where that would have been, if that's just like the mailbox that Larry's talking about. Could be many a mile or so away, or it could be right there at Mrs. Mott's. In any case, we found a couple of camps that simply are not identifiable as to whose side they're on. Next. And here's the artifacts from those sites. Nice drop balls and that sort of thing. We want for a camp. Next. Carronade. All right. Well, remember I told you that the British, according to Lee, had a carronade, a stubby cannon, a wall gun that they could put up and to defend themselves. But it was, according to Lee, never used. But the more work we do there, the more we find canister down the range coming, well, there's only 2 possibilities for you got this. So here's your canister being fired at that fort. That's nice. Maybe that one. But then you've got this stuff. You know, I suppose that the Americans could have been up there and some private walked by and hit the trail with a gun just as it went off. And, oh gosh, sorry guys, we didn't mean to do that. But more than likely, the carronade was being used by the British to try to stop the Americans. So when Lee says that didn't play no part in the battle, what he probably means is it had no effect, but it was being used by the British against the Americans. Next. All right, let's go back to the fire arrows. Okay, you gotta bear with me here, okay? Just entertain me for a few minutes. Fire arrows. Now, how did that thing get lit? We found this an intriguing story. How did it happen? Did Mrs. Motte actually give them an African bow? Next slide. Or was it fired by a musket? Here's Jim Lake, my colleague, with a Charlottesville, and as a honors thesis, Ellen Handwright, one of my students, decided she wanted to figure that out. Now I have we didn't get a very good video. I don't know if you want to try playing that. I'll tell you what, let's not play it. Let's finish the slideshow, then we'll go back and see if it'll actually pop up. When I do it, it messes your computer up pretty badly. Okay. That's okay, you're right there, that's good. So, musket arrows, let's just finish that off. We shot, the bottom line is it works. She did some research. She found that musket arrows were used on ships to fire into the rigging. You put an arrow into a musket, and on a ship, you fire it into your enemy rigging, that catches the rigging on fire. So they weren't exactly used a lot, but it wasn't unknown. Secondly, we fired the musket several times. We figured out that the musket, the arrow is not going to go like that, like a mortar, like I thought. It's going to go like that. And so as long as that arrow has, I don't know what the correct physics name is, I'm going to use momentum. As long as it has momentum, it goes straight and true. As soon as it loses that, it loses its stability, and it just goes anywhere. But so the Americans could have taken their muskets and fired directly into the roof, stuck into that roof, and caught fire to the roof using musket arrows. Next. Well, we keep working and working and working, and there you go. One day, Luther clears out this area of brush, and we find this little camp. Here's where the sap begins. This is a sharp cliff. That's the most level part. Right on this little semi-level part was a nice concentration of sharp little balls in a continental camp, more than likely. And what did we find? A nail that has been cold hammered into the shape of an arrow point. Now, again, you got entertainment here then. If the arrow point was found at the fort, we'd have confirmation of how the house caught on fire. They used fire arrows, just as Roland said, just as was said in history. It wasn't found at the fort, it was found at a camp near the entrance of the sap. Just as if Mrs. Motte came along and said, boy, this is important looking arrows there, guys. I'm not using mine. And they said, sure, and threw their stuff away. They abandoned this area. Next slide. There it is, conserved. And you can see these artifacts and an exhibit at the Confederate Relic Room right now. Everything I have here is, the artifacts are there. And it will be there until February of 2017.
Excuse me.
Final slide.
Some